So thanks everybody for coming. This is our monthly Open edX Architecture Hangout. And we have a few agenda items that were posted today, and feel free to chime in if you have other questions or things that you want to talk about. My thing with Zoom is that for some reason, whenever I open up the chat, okay, here it is. Maybe it'll work this time. I want to make sure that I am able to see questions as they come in, but if you see that I'm not responsive to the chat, then maybe Ned, if you're there, you can tell me if somebody is asking questions that I'm not aware of. Otherwise, I'll try my best there. Okay, great. So let's get started. Felipe did post a question on the wiki page regarding redirecting Studio to LMS. Felipe.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah, go ahead.
I don't have anything to present. Like I could share my screen with a clean installation that we did of Ironwood, and I was just curious of how it is supposed to work. Because in order to get Studio to work for me, what I had to do was basically hijack the session cookie domain and actually log into the LMS, but knowing that my session ID is stored on a path that on a domain that matches the domain of the LMS or a wildcard domain. That was the only way I got it to work. Yeah. And from the architectural idea that I had was that LMS was going to transfer the responsibility, Studio was going to transfer the responsibility of logging to the LMS, but it was going to work more like Insights does, or I don't know, e-commerce does, in the way that I can go there, I log in, and I come back with a request that actually logs me in whatever the domain of this Studio is.
Okay, yeah, so that's a great question, and actually allows us to then review some of the things that we spoke about yesterday. Last time. So if you guys remember, we talked a little bit about OAuth, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, remind us what the future direction is for what we want to do with, actually, let me bring up, yeah. So in the future direction, right, we want to have these micro front ends, which are very independently decoupled from the backend service. And in that regard, like Studio in the future, right, would be, the front end of Studio would be implemented as a separate micro front end. Right now, since Studio is still implemented in Django and so forth, like the micro front end and back end is all right now not separated. It's all within one instance, right? Just Studio overall. But in the future direction, we like to split that up. And then the way that would work in the future in regards to authentication is that you have a login micro front end and a login a user service. Now today this is the LMS. So but what would happen is if someone goes directly to Studio or to e-commerce or to some other micro front end, they will, if they're not logged in, they will get redirected to the login micro front end, which would then call the login on the backend microservice, which would then send a cookie back up, and then that cookie is then in the user's browser. So then when the user is in the micro front end, they're able to then use that login cookie for whatever backend APIs and whatnot that they need to call. Now this is the future direction. Not all of our code is there yet. However, if you start looking at some of the new React micro front ends that we've implemented, they are all now using this flow. Now for Studio, since it's not a completely separate micro front end right now, what we did was it doesn't necessarily make use of the cookie for making backend API calls and whatnot. However, we changed it as a step towards this path, so that Studio now, if you go directly to Studio, if you're not logged in, it will redirect you to the LMS's login API, and then it will come back. In order for this path to work, whether it's Studio or e-commerce or whatever, what Felipe said is correct, which is that the cookie, we do want to make sure that cookie is going to be usable by both the LMS by e-commerce, by studio and whatnot. So the domain name and the domain matching that happens in the cookie does need to work throughout our micro front end architecture there. So for example, if there is an OpenEdX instance that has something where it says studio hyphen, I don't know, open edX dot edX.org or something like that, that will not work if the cookie that it gets from LMS is lms.openedx.edx.org, right? Because the studio hyphen OpenEdX, that is not a subdomain of lms.openedx.edx.org. So from that perspective, we would need to think about we have to be intentional about what these domain names are of each of our microservices and micro front ends. So for what we did for edX.org is what we did was our cookies, the domain that's stamped in there, domain name that's stamped in there is edX.org. And so then all of our micro front ends and microservices are able to make use of that cookie. Now that is different from what currently happens for our e-commerce and other things, because they're not yet using micro front ends. They're using what's called the OAuth authorization protocol, right? So that's the authorization code grant type. So this is what they're using. And if you remember from last time, right, what happens there is the LMS here is the authorization server, and the client here is e-commerce. But then what happens is after doing this whole handshake back and forth, e-commerce then gets its own session cookie for its own service. And so if you look carefully in the cookie jar, in the browser's cookies, you will see that there's a session ID just for e-commerce for purposes of communicating with e-commerce. But that's what we're moving away from, because we have this new world of micro front ends where this path requires a back-end service to make this, to be done securely. So, but instead we're now moving towards this JOT, to having these JSON web tokens transported via cookies. So I didn't go through entirely what we talked about last time, but I'm hoping that if people who weren't there last time could go ahead and review that as well.
This leads me to questions. So
yep.
New services, like the user service you're mentioning here, will get its own domain, right? So what I will see on the browser is that I'm jumping domains from, I don't know, say user.edx.org to courses.edx.org to studio.edx.org. And I'm just jumping back and forth, and since the cookie, the session ID is shared among all those, then it just works.
Right.
Isn't it dangerous that in order for me to do that, I need to share my session cookie with absolutely every domain that's on that path? Because for me internally, this creates a complete, like a very difficult scenario in terms of multi-tenancy, but that's my problem. I'll deal with that later. But right now, I have customers who have this on their university page. So they have something like courses.university.com or .edu. Then they have www.university.edu, and then they have studio.university.edu. So I don't want to share the cookies from courses to LMS, from courses to studio, so that authors can go to studio and log in and come back. But I don't necessarily want to share that cookie with www.university, because basically we don't control that page. Anyone could, like some other entity that's not the one managing OpenEdX, could read that cookie and do whatever they want. Just as easy as log it and then try to use it for something else.
Right. Yeah, no, this protocol is meant to be used for services that are within the trusted domain, right? So this is really like, if we had one mega monolith of all of our services, then this wouldn't be an issue, right? It's because we want to break up our services into smaller components and microservices and micro front ends. The trust domain, though, remains the same, where it's still just one authority, where that is issuing and verifying these cookies.
Yes, but before
However,
on that,
if you're going to cross the trust domain boundary, though, like for instance, if you are integrating with another school and they need to be able to authenticate with you and whatnot, then you want to go back to and revert to the OAuth protocol handshake.
Is that an option right now?
Yeah, so not for Studio though, because for Studio itself, we're thinking of Studio as being part of our trust domain. It's one of our core services. So we hadn't thought of Studio in that regard. However, if you do want to integrate with an external service, let's say with a external school's, I don't know, SIS system or something like that, then yes, then you would just go ahead and use the authorization code grant type. That is
sure, but that holds true also for edX. Like, what if edX as a company decides that the managing the marketing page at www.edx.org, it's a concern they no longer want, and they want to have a third party do it. I don't know if it's a third party who does it right now.
Right. So then we would not use
the session cookies being shared to that Drupal domain all the time.
Right. So no, we would, if it is an external service, even if it's redx.org, we would not share our session cookie. We would not include their domain in our session cookie, right? We would use a different protocol like this to integrate.
Right now you can't. That's what I'm saying. Like, you need to have everything living on the same subdomain. Like, there is no. I can tell you, like, share it with courses.edx.org and with studio.edx.org, but do not share it with www.edx.org.
So
like, right now you made it so that you are forced to have everything that lives under that subdomain has to be trusted. It's a yes or no.
I think that there is a way to make it work, Felipe, without any modification. So as long as this is Omar. Okay, so as long as you are within the same, so for example, I assume that you have a university, for example, that has courses.university.edu, okay, and you fully control that specific backend. However, you have no control or very little over the www.university.edu part of it, correct?
That's correct. That's exactly my concern.
Okay, so I assume that if the cookie was made as a HTTP only, in which that the front end does not have access, then you should be safe to log in as an admin on that domain without fearing to that your cookie would be shared with other.
No, but even if it's HTTP only, I'm sending that HTTP only cookie to the page that renders the www or something. Like, they could have a very insecure Joomla installation, and then my most precious cookie, the admin session, is now living in every application that lives under the same domain.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so the thing is, a cookie does not go to that external service. The cookie is only, it's sent, right? So the cookie here is sent from our edX backend services to the user's browsers. It stays in the user's browser, right?
It's sent on every request.
It's sent on any request, but it's only then sent on any request back to the backend services that are in the edX domain. It is not
exactly. Right. I don't control the complete domain. Like, I control courses.university and studio.university, but I don't control www.university. But it's still going to be sent there because it lives under the same subdomain.
Ah, I see what you're saying. So then it does require you to then change if www.university, if you're not able to change that domain address, then you might need to change the domain addresses of the other.
Yeah. So a new, like an installation of OpenEDX starting on Ironwood cannot live under a domain that has already something on it.
Yeah, I think you do need to be intentional about what you are naming your studio and your courses.
That's difficult for entities that already have like thousands of courses being launched at something like courses.university, which it's the case for at least 3 of my bigger customers. So that's why I'm taking their position. Naturally, I can go and change the code and just make them live on a port of mine that doesn't have this restriction.
Right.
But I think it's a little broad to assume that everyone can change or dispose of the complete subdomain of a university.
Right.
Yeah. Lagunitas.stanford might be something that they want to share it, but they don't want to share it with www.stanford because they are competing teams and whatnot.
Does OAuth solve the problem?
Sorry, what you were saying?
Does OAuth solve the problem? So if, let's say, Studio supports OAuth handshake from the LMS, does that solve the problem?
It does, because then Studio has its own key, its own cookie living under studio.university.edu. So yes, they all go back and forth, and logging out is normally a pain because you need to wait the 5 seconds validation where you open all the iframes that log you out of everything. But at least every cookie lives in its specific domain. We do.
Okay.
We use every now and then for some customers the ability to share the cookie among for all the subdomains of a given domain, and that's very useful for the marketing side integration. So I'm very familiar with that, but not all my customers would approve to it, especially the larger ones. Like the smaller ones, I could just force them into, but the larger ones, the national government of X country may not want to comply to this. So I'm going, right now I'm thinking I need to fork Idlewood and have a complete, like a parallel version that works, but I would rather not. I would like a way for me to either support OAuth on Studio or not have this restriction be so hard-coded. And I'm willing to do the OAuth on Studio thing and try to bring it back to the community. But
well,
just
not just
in terms of the vision of the authentication, that premise that you can control the whole subdomain might not be true for everyone.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought this up, and Ned had also brought this up a few weeks ago to me as well. This is, just so you know, this is the direction that we are headed. So it's not, although it's Studio today, and in some ways it's good that we discovered this issue in Ironwood. Yeah, exactly. So right now, for instance, the team is working on rewriting our profile page. The profile page is going to be in the micro front end. After that, it's going to be account settings. After that, maybe it'll be the dashboard, the learner dashboard. So all of these things are all going to be rewritten in micro front ends. And so we are going to run into this. And whether it's called, dashboard.university.edu or, profile.university.edu, like we'll need to figure out what we call that.
Yes, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to happen. Like something like this is going to happen for more services as you explained.
Yes, exactly. And so I think we need to come up with the right design approach that works for both for you and other Open edX instances that are in the same similar boat. I'd rather it not be something like, if you need to do something for the short term for Studio, that's fine. But I think very soon, in order to keep up with our changes, we'll need to figure out how to make it work for in general.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think go ahead.
No. Just an idea for me.
Yeah, let's figure. And the other thing is, just FYI, even for edX.org, we need to have a discussion about what we are going to be naming things, our domain names and stuff, because we're hearing different requirements from our enterprise clients as well as like our university partners and all that stuff. Like I think in terms of how they want their site to be called and things like that. So that will also have implications on perhaps how we how
Do
we
you support any sort of multi-tenancy for the big OpenEDX instance? You had MIT professionals a while ago, but I don't know if that's still a
yeah,
thing.
so whether we support multi-tenancy, right, or we support multi-instance, right? So basically a single tenant on multiple instances, right? Or do we have one instance with multiple tenants? That is something that we are trying to figure out for edX. What's the right long-term vision here? There is definitely a trade-off, right? And I think at this point in time, I mean, anyway, this is very early right now. I'm just letting you know that this is something that we're scheduling discussions to try to figure out where we want to head there. By needing to support multi-tenancy within the same single instance, it does add overall complexity to the platform, and developers, right, need to figure out, handle site configuration amongst other configuration and all that stuff. So this is something that is going to impact both OpenEDX and edX, right, in terms of what we want to do there going forward.
I'm not even suggesting that you have to support multi-tenancy. That's important for me, and perhaps a few others, but that's if it's 5, it's already too much. But just asking because this would also make it difficult for someone who's used to I don't know, multi-tenant like white label or whatever it's called site to log into Studio. But that's how I first found it. But yeah. Then we launched the master branch of Ironwood, and we still found it difficult to navigate. So
yeah, and by the way, the way that is currently handled right now on edX.org is that if it is a white label site, we do have the domain names in the cookies be different, right?
Yeah, or so the session cookie or bio.
Right, exactly. And so that's how we keep that security domain separate from edX.org security domain, is because they just have their cookies are stamped with different domains.
But then in order to log to Studio, you need to use the same credentials you use on MIT professionals back into courses.openedx.org and kind of break that mind barrier.
But that white label site's Studio address would also be different. It would be for that white label site.
Right now it can't be, or is it?
It can, yes.
Right now?
Yes. Because, right, so like so it's whitelabel.university.edu, or sorry, what's an example? Like studio.whitelabel.edu, right? Well, white label is our name.
That's the same multi-tenant Studio, but you force them there. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that does work. And then there's courses.whitelabel.edu. But for that white label site, you have to configure Studio and LMS and all of them to use that cookie domain name, right? Sure. Specifically just for that white label site. So that allows you to compartmentalize the domain for that white label site and keep that different from the other sites.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So Namisha, I guess the question at this point is, as we continue to make these sorts of changes, how do we involve the community as early as possible so that we're all going down the same path together?
Yeah, well, I think for me, just personally, right, this was a learning path for me to realize that these types of changes impact the community to this extent, which, to be honest, I was not aware. So that is a communication that just, basically making us aware of that. So that's one point. But the other point is that, like I said, was telling Felipe, we're going to do even more of these changes going forward with micro front ends. And how are we going to support deployment of micro front ends? How are we going to support naming them and the URL paths? All of those things are very much right now ripe for communication. The other thing that I added to today's agenda was to also, I had put out a call for a theming advisory group that is going to also impact like how one customizes front ends and supports multiple sites and all that stuff. So I'm looking to create a group that can help us, that can help advise us. And I think because you guys are a lot more aware of that than we are, because you do a lot more of, you know, creating multiple sites.
I saw the calls for this several times, and I never submitted myself or anyone in my team because we're not experts in Redux or React. But if we can bring any vision into how multi-tenancy and multi-theming looks like for us, or might look like for someone else, we'd be super happy to join.
Yes, and I think that would be great. It doesn't have to be a React expert, because that we do have people here who are, you know, either were experts in React or becoming experts in React. But I think what we really lack right now in edX is an awareness of how people are doing, supporting multiple sites, and you know, your customization needs. So this way, where we are going in the future, one approach and mindset that I have is that I want to be a little bit more intentional about what that interface is, so that it's clear to us what we are supporting. Right now, we don't know what we are supporting because it's very open-ended, right?
Yep.
But I think having the theming advisory group, basically, and maybe theming is not the right word there. Maybe it's multi-site, or I don't know. We'll have to.
Maybe theming it is. It's just that we are strange in the way that we do multi-sites.
Yeah. So, okay, I will add, Felipe, if you can let me know whether it's you or someone else on your team who could be part of that, that would be great. And for other people who
are here in this call, but let me discuss with them afterwards, and we'll see who goes there.
Sounds good. And then for other people who are on this call or listening to this afterwards, if please send me via Slack or email, however you can contact me, which a representative from your company who would be interested in being part of this advisory group. And this is very timely. I think we would probably also want to meet together at the OpenNX conference if you are there. And then over the next several months, like even before the summertime, we'll want to have maybe 2 or 3 meetings to get input from this group. So, and then this could be the group that we can then also, as we're making changes, get input from you guys on how it could impact your teams.
And since Namisha mentioned the conference, I'll just reiterate my call for topics for the Friday full day Dev Summit. Anything that's on your mind that you'd like to talk with other OpenEdX people about, especially with edX people, if you haven't gotten an email from me or seen it on the mailing list, send me an email and I'll make sure you have all the information. It's going to be a great opportunity for you to have your voice heard. So put topics on the wiki page.
Okay, great. So I think that covered the first and third agenda item here. I was going to go into the authorization design. So I think last time when we talked about authentication, John Baldwin, who's not here right now, but he had asked about authorization, what our plans were for that. So I'm going to jump into that unless if someone else had other questions. Okay, great. So this is very high level right now. I have links on this wiki to the 2 documents that are currently still in wiki state. They will need to create an OEP for this. But as many of you guys who are familiar with our platform, right, would know, like, we are lacking right now in a good platform-wide authorization framework. So it's definitely high time that the edX platform implement and support something. So, but this is just a visualization of what we're thinking, where, you know, allow us to have a hierarchy of roles, just like in authentication, right? Where we needed to think about a framework that would allow us to support microservices and micro front ends, right? This is a similar thing where it's not just one particular monolith, but we need to make this work in a distributed system. So from that perspective, we want to decouple the concept of system-wide roles. These are roles that apply throughout all services in the platform, versus feature-specific roles. Now, these are, you know, roles for a particular Django app or particular feature and whatnot. And there's a relationship between these system-wide roles and a feature-specific roles. The system-wide role is something that is, we do want it to be configurable. So it would be in Django settings, as is a proposal here, so that each OpenEdX instance can define what their system-wide roles are. And the user service is a centralized service that would be able to keep track of what those roles are. And then there's a mapping between that and the feature-specific roles. And that too could be in Django settings, but because of, right, the dependency inversion, like the solid design principles, right, whatever is feature-specific, we don't want the system-wide or centralized service necessarily to know about or be bothered with feature-specific details. So that's why it's this mapping between the system-wide roles and feature-specific roles would be stored, within the feature itself. So the feature is the one that manages all of this related to the feature. And the system-wide role just needs to know about a system-wide one.
Sorry, Misha, in this context, a feature could be something like course enrollment. That's a feature. And then you might need some specific authorizations for enrollment different than what you need for like administration or course authoring.
Right, yeah, no, that is a good example, like course enrollment. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Yeah. So course enrollment is who is able to administer, right, capabilities of for a particular course, whether or not it is open to all enrollees or only certain enrollees, and then who even has like super user type of access to say whether a course does have, basically who's able to even manage those roles for a course or for the enrollments, right? So all of that stuff is concepts related to enrollments, which is specific to that feature. Another example, which we do have actually right now in the platform, is discussion forums. And within discussion forums, you could have a forums administrator, forums TA, right? Those are all roles specific to discussion forums. So this model is basically trying to generalize this and make it more clear of how we would implement that. And then in terms of enforcing those roles, right, the way that we would like to do that is by having permissions at the feature for each feature, and these are declared. And there is an OAuth, so OAuth 4 talks about using Django rules as a way to implement and declare those permissions. So so that's how we would want to implement that. And then on this side, on the left-hand side, right, this is just basically talking about how there was, a centralized place that basically it's a user service, which keeps track of all the users in the system. And then there's a mapping between a user and their roles. And that's also something that the user service can manage. And then how that gets transported to all of our different microservices and micro frontends would be in a JSON web token. So the JSON web token keeps a mapping between, okay, for this user that this token belongs to, these are their system-wide roles. And so that's how that gets propagated through the system. And so I think that's pretty much it. If a feature wants to have directly manipulate, it does not want to go through system-wide roles, but if it also wants to assign users directly to its own roles, right? Then it would store that within its feature, where there's a dynamic way to say for this particular, like, who are the forums TAs, who are the course enrollment administrators, all of those things could then be a mapping between the user and the feature specific role. And that would be stored with the feature.
I'm not so familiar with Django Web Tokens, but in this case, if anything changes regarding my permissions, do I have to log out and log back in to have those being reloaded?
If anything changes with your permissions, then
if I'm giving a new system-wide role or a feature-specific role, do I have to re-log in order for those new permissions to actually kick in?
Yeah. So if you to evolve a system, so let's say we start off with only 4 system-wide roles, right? It could be global staff, it could be whether or not you're a course author, I mean, some things like that, whether you're an enterprise user, that type of thing. Let's say we start off with 4, and then now we want to introduce a 5th one, then, well, first of all, yes, since we were thinking it's a Django setting, so you would need to update your OpenEdX instance to introduce that 5th role. And you're right that if there are any cookies and JSON web tokens that are already propagating and out there, those will not know about the 5th role. But the other thing that you have to realize is that since it is a 5th role, you will need to then also assign who has that role. So that is a change, right? The user needs to go ahead and get assigned to that new role. So it might take an hour, right? It depends on what you set as your expiration date for your JSON web token. For edX.org, we set our expiration for JOTS right now, I think is to an hour. So it might take an hour, for instance, to then propagate these changes through.
But that doesn't mean they have to recreate a session. It's just that when the token dies out, then
yes,
the platform will create a new one, and then I have my new permission.
Right.
It's just,
yes.
It's just a timing thing.
Yes.
It takes time to propagate, but it doesn't necessarily mean I have to do my session creation again.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And to be clear, we haven't implemented this yet. This is still very early design stage. So I just wanted to let you guys know that this is something that the team here is actively looking into. And Brittany, who is on our enterprise team, she has written this document where she goes a little bit more into the detail of how we're currently planning to, so that also is linked from our wiki page for today's Hangout, where she goes in and talks a little bit about her thoughts on using what's Django role permissions is a library that we found that we may make use of to implement some of the things that we talked about. So anyway, if you guys have time and interest, you can take a look at it. And like I said, eventually this will be an OEP that will be coming our way. So any questions on that?
Yeah, thanks, Nimisha.
Yep.
So about the feature, when you say feature, like, is course becoming like a feature because we have a lot of permissions around course, including course staff, beta users, and whatnot. I'm not really sure that I captured that during your.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for asking. So the course is an object, right? It's an object in our system, and so when we're thinking about permissions, I didn't go into this too abstractly here, but like, so you know, these are things that, by the way, are inspired by role-based access control, and you know, there's different ways of thinking about access management. So role-based access and role hierarchy and, you know, things like that are basically, it's user to role mapping and then role to permission mapping. Those are basically the 3 high-level things when you're thinking about role-based access control. Now, the other things, like for those of us who, you know, are thinking about more Linux and things like that, you guys may have been more familiar with ACLs, like access control lists. And access control lists, right, are for a given object, who are the groups or users who have access to this object. So what I find that works well and scales well is actually a combination of both, where you have this top level perspective on this role-based access control system with users, roles, and permissions. But then you also have some form of ACLs. So, you know, when you asked about courses, so in my mind, like a course is an object. An X block would also be an object. And so from that perspective, you want to still be able to have an idea of, okay, who has access to this object and what type of access. So in our edX platform, you take an object like a course, then you think about, okay, well, who is enrolled in the course, and who are authors of this course, who are maybe financial administrators of the course, or who's able to, you know, manage or access analytics of the course, you know, all of those types of things. But in the end, those would be permissions around that object that is a course. Now, because we could have a large system like edX.org that might have, let's just say 2,000 courses. We don't necessarily in the user's token want to list what are all the courses that they have access to and what type of permission, right? So in the token that gets passed around and that's in the user's cookie, we just want to have something that's more generic, a role that might say whether or not, are they even a course staff of anything, or, you know, are they, enrolled in any courses, you know, whatever we decide are like good generic things that we want to put in a token, and that doesn't get bloated. But then if you want to then go and ask about specific course or a specific right permission, then that is something that you would have to go, yes, to the feature and ask them more details about that user and what access they have for that particular object. Did that answer your question? Was that Omar who asked? Or...
Yes.
Oh yeah.
That was me. Thank you.
Yeah. Did that answer your question, Omar?
Yeah. I mean, it's still a lot of reading for me, I guess. I'm aware of like only simple ICLs back in my PHP days, designing sites from scratch. Apart from that, at this scale, I do realize that we do like a proper authorization system, and I'm happy that we are moving toward one.
Right.
Still have a lot of reading to actually form an opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And like I said, it's really early stage, so we are going to write this up. And if you are familiar with ACLs and simple ACLs, then yes, I mean, just think about the fact that we will still want to have ACLs, right? But where do those ACLs get stored? We don't want to store those ACLs in a centralized service that we're always pinging all the time, right? So whenever a user comes in and wants to make access a course, like we don't want to necessarily go ahead and hit a centralized service all the time that's going to result in scalability and availability issues. So that's why what we're doing is we're actually thinking about a hybrid approach where you have a role-based thing. So the role goes with the user, and like, hey, I'm the admin, or I'm the whatever. But then, so this way, whenever they make backend API calls, it's kind of clear where they are and who they are at a high level scale. But then the backend service needs to know more about the ACLs and then map those ACLs to some default relationship with the system-wide roles. So I think what we'll do is we can, you know, once we have more specific details and more examples, maybe that's a better way of diving into and get something more concrete out of how this will actually pan out. So. Any other questions then regarding this? It sounds like there's, I just wanted to let you guys know that this was happening, and we will probably flesh this out more. Okay, cool. So I think that's all I had for those topics. I did propose a topic of asking if the community had any feedback around some of the processes that we've put in place around DEPR and OEPs, and the communication methods and whether or not how that's working and what not working. Open like these community hangouts and architecture hangouts, Slack channels, how basically if you guys could just have any feedback in general about communication, that would be great.
I think in general, the communications about deprecations have been pretty good, but I think keep it up. And because the life cycle of deprecation can be really long, I think it is helpful to
kind of err on the side of communicating a lot again when it moves from stage to stage. You know, I felt like I was tracking a lot of them pretty closely, but some of them are taking longer. And I think like I think we missed the Datadog one somehow. So definitely more communication better.
Would it help to have a separate mailing list that we also target? Or, I mean, I know edX code can get noisy with a lot of other things, or does, like, do people use filters to search for Depper in the title? Is that been sufficient?
Would it make sense to have just a table of what's being deprecated and the timelines, maybe? Just like a
right.
page?
So we do, yeah. So we do have a Jira board for that.
And a wiki page. We should publicize both of those.
Wiki page. Yeah, the wiki page was really more just for an initial thing, but the Jira board is actually, yeah, that was just us for trying to like get our thoughts together on like how to approach it and what's coming. But like, but I think if you want, like, so this Jira board has, let me remove this, sorry.
The one there that scared me was remove microsites. But what do I know?
No, it didn't scare me, and that's what I do for a living. So don't worry, it'll be fine.
Okay, great.
We'll be fine. Okay, good. I think microsites was an earlier version or something. Is that right, Felipe?
It's kind of being superseded by site configurations. So the one thing that made sense was, or if you were using microsites with a backend in your database, then you could move into site configurations pretty easily. We didn't, but because we implement our own backend, and since like 1 year ago, the OpenEDX backend broke and we didn't notice. So people started asking on the microsites channel on the Slack why this and that wasn't working. And I kind of went blank, like I have no idea because we are using our own backend.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's better to remove it.
Yeah.
If it's going to be broken, then it makes no sense.
That's definitely true.
So, but anyway, so we do have this board, and so it does give people an idea of like things, what things are in each phase, and the columns on this board map 1-to-1 for what we have in the OAuth. So the OAuth has more details of what each of these phases mean. But Peter, I do take your point, and so I think what I'll do is I'll go back to the team in-house and just recommend that when we go through each phase, we also go ahead and maybe respond to that email that we sent earlier or something, just to, as an update, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. We'll do that. Cool. It sounds like the timeline that we've been using has been okay, though, right? In terms of announcement. Yeah. Okay. So it's more about the communication as we transition through. Cool. Any other thoughts or any other? I mean, opening the floor to any questions that people may have in general. Ned, what do you have so far for the Dev Summit?
I'm not sure we have anything on the list for the Dev Summit yet. I know Marco is working on the things that the product people here would like to talk about.
Okay.
But yes, it is a wide open field. You can be a first mover, get in on the ground floor for setting the agenda for the Dev Summit.
I think I'd like to, if I want to remind everyone again about the theming advisory group that was mentioned earlier in this Hangout. If you can give a representative from your company to be part of that, that would be great. This is something that we'll want to make use of over the next few months, especially between now and summertime. So that'll be great. And maybe the Dev Summit could also be a place where we have initial conversations about this as well, or maybe not initial or second conversations. Micro front ends and how that impacts Open edX is definitely a topic that, Ned, I'd like to put on there too. Yeah.
Okay, we have a topic.
I'm always happy to talk about extensibility, but I have a talk on that. But plugins and how to make plugins more powerful or touch more areas of the platform.
Okay. That sounds good.
Block store.
Sorry, say that again?
We should have something about block store.
What
block store.
And what in particular? Information going out or design coming in, or?
I think, first of all, information going out. I mean, we had some time on it last year, but I think we need an update on, you know, what's been implemented and what decisions have been made. And I presume there's probably still some points where input would be helpful.
Okay.
I'm not as close to it as I sound like I am, so.
No, I think that's great. I think one Dev Summit top is also going to be around adaptive learning and the course authoring experience around it. And it is very also similar to, or not similar, but it's related to Blockstore and the authoring experience around Blockstore. And that's definitely a topic that needs a lot more attention. So.
Also, Ned, I'm going to talk for OpenCraft or maybe Xavier only when I said he's going to propose governance at some point.
Okay.
So you might as well just have it on the list as well.
Who was going to propose it?
Xavier from OpenCraft.
Ah, okay.
Last time I wanted to go play with theming, and he said, like, aren't you coming to the governance meeting? So he dragged me.
And how was it?
It was very interesting. I don't recall that we did like anything actionable came out of that, but it was a good discussion.
All right.
Okay, great. So we have about 5 minutes left. Was there any other topics?
Nimisha, just to follow up on my previous set of questions about Studio, does it make sense that for the at least Ironwood period, or maybe Ironwood and Juniper, whatever the next release is called period, we do something about the LMS and Studio supporting OAuth, like as an external pull request, or that we patch it somewhere? Because we're going to probably do it anyways in our fork, so we might as well try to bring it into a community.
So how extensive a change would that be?
I have no idea.
It sounds like the kind of thing that we wouldn't put into Ironwood at this point, just because at this point we're trying to stabilize Ironwood and not add new capabilities to it.
Sure.
But we understand that the change in Studio authentication might not fit what the community needs, and so we'd want to look at your solution and see if that's a good way to make Open edX work better for everyone.
I'll try to rush in sometime from either this sprint.nx to see what that would take.
Okay.
And if nothing else, we can talk over the conference about that. Maybe we have a prototype in place or something.
Okay.
By the way, we already installed Ironwood, and our testing was like very smooth. Nothing broke.
Great.
I'll send you a link if you want to test it.
No, I trust your testing.
Our installation.
It's good to get the data point, though. Thank you for reporting a positive data point. It's good to hear the successes as well as the problems.
And Felipe, maybe if we want, we could go a little bit more in detail of what a proposed design could be, so that it will save some time. Because we've been making a lot of changes on authentication recently, and we've also been removing old authentication implementations and libraries. So yeah, so I think, like, for instance,
to the other services like e-commerce and insights, because if nothing else, I was thinking of going into insights and/or e-commerce and see how it's done there, and try to map that into Studio. That would be my initial thought.
Yeah. So let's, how about you and I set up some time and we can go into it. Yeah, I actually just last week we went through and updated e-commerce to but that's still using single sign-on via OAuth authorization code grant. So we didn't change that, but we changed it to no longer use the old Django OAuth provider, but to use the newer Django OAuth toolkit. So yes, I'm very familiar now with that implementation, so we can talk about that. But the other thing is I want to just understand that there isn't another alternative that works, that moves us in the direction that we need to move towards for micro front ends. But that's why I want to just dive deep with you on that.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. So let me know what time suits you, and
yeah. Okay, sounds good.
Make some space for that.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Sorry to be so annoying with all my questionings.
Oh, no, not at all. It's good. If we don't hear the questions, we don't know what's going on out there. So it's great.
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks. See you, everybody. Bye-bye.